In Washington, D.C., silence is a rare and expensive commodity. It is bought with power, earned through reputation, and often it is merely the deep, quiet breath before the storm. In the Georgetown townhouse of Catherine Sterling, silence was the architecture of her life. It was in the hushed weight of antique Persian rugs that drank the sound from every footstep. It was in the walls lined with thousands of books, their spines a silent chorus of history, philosophy, and law. It was the currency of late nights spent in her study, a room paneled in dark, solemn cherrywood, where the only sound was the rustle of paper and the soft, distant hum of a city that never truly slept. Catherine, or Kate, as she was known to the few people who could claim intimacy, was the steward of this silence. At 48, she was the editor-in-chief of the American Perspective, not just a magazine, but an institution. It was a journalistic titan, a place where facts were quarried, polished, and laid into place with the precision of a master stonemason. Her father had founded it on a single, unwavering principle. The truth, told plainly and without fear, was the immune system of a republic. Kate had not just inherited his title, she had inherited his creed. Her name was synonymous with integrity, her mind a steel trap for inconsistency, her gaze a lie detector that had made senators sweat and CEOs stammer. She was not a kingmaker, she was a truth-teller, a role she considered far more sacred. Her life was a fortress built of routine and discipline. Board meetings, editorial reviews, charity dinners where she moved with a reserved grace, her presence a quiet, gravitational force. And at the center of this well-ordered universe was her husband of 22 years, Professor Miles Donovan. If Kate was the city's unblinking conscience, Miles was its captivating soul. A celebrated professor of history at Georgetown, he possessed a charm that was both academic and deeply human. He could hold a lecture hall of jaded postgrads in rapt attention, weaving narratives of fallen empires and political intrigue with the skill of a master storyteller. He was the warm, approachable half of their power couple, his easy laugh and disarming smile a perfect counterpoint to Kate's formidable intellect. Theirs was a partnership seen as an alliance of Washington's best qualities, the rigor of journalism and the wisdom of history. It was envied, admired, and universally considered unbreachable. The first tremor that would shatter this foundation did not come with a roar, but with a soft, rhythmic buzz. It was a Tuesday night, just past 11. Kate was in her study putting the final touches on a scathing investigative piece about lobbying loopholes. The city lights of D.C. Spread out below her window, a web of white and gold against the inky black of the Potomac. Her phone lying face down on the polished mahogany desk vibrated. Once, twice. She rarely bothered with notifications. Her digital life was a managed affair, filtered through an assistant. But this was different. This came through Signal, an encrypted app she used for sensitive sources. The message was from a contact with no name, only a string of numbers. A ghost. Her journalistic instincts, never truly dormant, stirred. She picked up the phone. The message itself was stark, devoid of greeting or explanation. 4 words. I thought you should know. Below the text was an image. For a long, suspended moment, Kate's mind refused to process the scene. It was a low-quality photo, grainy and poorly lit, clearly snapped with a phone. But the setting was as familiar to her as her own reflection. It was her study, her sanctuary. The antique mahogany desk was unmistakable. So was the faint gleam of her Pulitzer Prize, sitting on the credenza behind the chair. And on the wall, the custom-built bookshelf, with the rare first edition of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America sitting in its designated place. But it was the subject of the photograph that made the air evacuate her lungs. A young woman, someone Kate had never seen before, was sitting in her chair. Kate's chair. The one her father had used for 30 years before her. The young woman was beautiful in a sharp, modern way, with dark hair and a defiant, almost smug pout. She was looking directly into the camera, and in her hand she was holding an object with a casual possessiveness that felt like a physical blow. It was Kate's pen. Not just any pen. It was a Mont Blanc Meisterstück, a gift from her father when she was named his successor. Its cap was worn smooth from his hand, its weight in hers a constant, tangible link to his legacy. And this stranger, this girl, was holding it as if it were a cheap souvenir. She had one leg hooked over the arm of the chair, her expression a toxic cocktail of triumph and challenge. She was making a statement. I was here. I sat in your chair. I touched your legacy. The world tilted. The cherrywood walls, once a source of comfort, seemed to lean in, the air growing thick and suffocating. Each breath was a conscious effort. The first wave to hit her was a pure, visceral violation. This was not the clumsy betrayal of a secret affair in a sterile hotel room. This was a targeted desecration, an invasion. This woman had been in her home, in her most private space. And Miles had allowed it. He had brought this intruder into the very heart of their fortress. The pain was swiftly followed by something colder, sharper, and far more familiar. It was the sterling steel. Her father had been famous for it, a quiet, analytical fury that could dismantle a flawed argument or a dishonest man, line by line, fact by fact. Kate had always channeled that fire into her work, using it to forge editorials and expose corruption. She had never, not once, imagined she would have to turn it on her own life. Now she felt it uncoiling in her chest. Not a hot, messy rage, but a chilling, clarifying focus. She stood up, her movements measured, and walked to the vast window. She looked down at the city, a place of power plays and whispered secrets, a city she understood better than anyone. The American perspective was more than a magazine. It was an instrument. Her father had used it to hold power accountable. He had once told her, Kate, people will trade in money, in influence, in secrets, but the only currency that lasts is the truth, and we are the mint. Her mind, honed by decades of crisis management and complex investigations, began to work. The emotional shock receded, replaced by the cold, clear logic of a journalist confronted with a story. A messy private divorce was the conventional path. Lawyers, settlements, a quiet retreat to preserve dignity and hide the shame. It was what was expected of women in her position. But the sheer audacity of this act demanded a different response. The photograph was not a mistake. It wasn't a careless slip. It was a message, a declaration. A deliberate act of psychological warfare from a mistress who felt untouchable, and from a husband who had grown arrogant, careless. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. They had forgotten who she was. She was not just a wife to be cheated on. She was Catherine Sterling. And this was her city, her magazine, her truth. She turned from the window, her decision crystallizing in the silence. This would not be a private humiliation. They had brought the war to her home. She would fight it on her own terms, on her own turf, but not with a cannon, not with a public explosion. That was their crude, brutish method. Hers would be the scalpel. She would find the narrative, follow the facts, and expose the truth of this story, whatever that truth might be. The rage was now fully awake, its cold fire spreading through her veins, not as a destructive force, but as fuel. The investigation had just begun, and she, Catherine Sterling, would be the lead reporter. The sun rose over Washington, D.C. with a deceptive bureaucratic calmness, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of Georgetown. But inside the Sterling Donovan residence, the dawn felt different. The silence that had once been a comfort was now a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every familiar object, a book left on the coffee table, a pair of reading glasses on a side table, seemed alien, part of a life that had belonged to someone else. The house was no longer a home. It had become a crime scene, and Catherine Sterling was its sole, meticulous investigator. Sleep had been a useless luxury. Instead, she had spent the pre-dawn hours doing what she did best, gathering information. She did not start with her husband. Confrontation without data was an amateur's game, an emotional outburst. Kate dealt in facts. The anonymous message had been a tip, and she treated it as such. The first step in any investigation is to understand the players. In the cold blue light of her laptop screen, the digital ghost of the young woman in the photograph began to take form. Her name, a quick cross-reference of Georgetown University directories and social media breadcrumbs revealed, was Ashley Finch, 24 years old, a graduate student in the history department specializing in post-war European political movements. Her academic advisor, the man who guided her research and would ultimately hold her future in his hands, was Professor Miles Donovan. Kate's fingers moved across the keyboard with a chilling detachment. She found Ashley's Instagram profile, a carefully curated gallery of a young intellectual on the rise. Photos of her at academic conferences, posing with visiting dignitaries, and holding cappuccinos in sun-drenched European cafes. It was a portrait of ambition, but it was the captions that Kate dissected with forensic precision. They were littered with quotes from historical figures, subtle allusions to power, and a recurring theme of staking one's claim in the world. This was not the profile of a starstruck student. It was the work of a strategist, a woman who understood optics. This confirmed Kate's initial assessment. The selfie was not an accident. It was a shot across the bow. The final piece of data she needed was confirmation of her husband's schedule. A quick, discreet check of their shared calendar showed that last Thursday evening, while Kate was at a fundraising dinner for the Committee to Protect Journalists, Miles had an entry marked simply, Research Meeting, Finch. The location was listed as Home Office. Her home office. Her study. Her chair. The timeline clicked into place, cold and hard and irrefutable. Only then, with the facts arrayed before her, like soldiers on a chessboard, did she prepare for the confrontation. She found him in the kitchen. He was dressed for his morning lecture, looking every bit the part of the distinguished professor. He was pouring coffee, the morning light catching the silver at his temples, a picture of domestic normalcy that was now grotesque. He smiled as she entered, a smile that had once been the bedrock of her world. "Morning," he said, his voice warm. "Slept well?" Kate did not return the smile. She walked to the marble island and placed her phone on its cool surface. The screen lit up with the image of Ashley Finch in her chair. She slid it across the island towards him. It came to a stop just beside his coffee cup. She said nothing. The silence was her opening statement. The sequence of emotions that played across Miles's face was a study in disintegration. First, confusion, a slight furrowing of the brow. Then, dawning recognition, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. It was followed by a flash of pure animal panic, the blood draining from his face, leaving his academic tan looking pale and sickly. He looked from the phone to her face and back again. The charm, the easy confidence, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a man stripped bare. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed, the sound loud in the cavernous silence of the kitchen. "Kate," he began, his voice a raw whisper. I can explain." "Can you?" Her voice was unnervingly calm, devoid of heat. It was the voice she used when cross-examining a hostile source, a tone that offered no quarter and expected none. He stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. He called it a mistake, a moment of unforgivable stupidity, a lapse in judgment. He spoke of pressure, of loneliness, of the flattery of a young, admiring student. Each word was a shovel, digging his hole deeper. "She meant nothing to me, Kate. You have to believe that. It was meaningless." It was that word, meaningless, that pierced through her analytical calm. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about jealousy, about the simple, sordid fact of another woman. He failed to grasp the true nature of his crime. "Meaningless?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than a shout. "You brought her into our home, Miles, into my study. You allowed her to sit in my chair, to touch the things my father gave me. You didn't just break a vow, you desecrated a sanctuary. You seem to believe this was a failure of the heart. What I see is a failure of character, a failure of intelligence." He recoiled as if struck. "That's not fair. I made a terrible mistake, but I am not a monster." "I never said you were," Kate replied, her cold precision returning. "Monsters are simple. You are something far more complex and far more disappointing. You are a man who has become careless with things of great value. My trust, our history, the very integrity you teach your students about." The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with his defeated silence. He had no defense. She had conducted a perfect autopsy of his betrayal, leaving his excuses laid bare and useless on the operating table. But Kate knew this was only the beginning. He was wounded, but the root of the problem remained. The insolence of the act required a response. A public accusation was too crude, a messy divorce too conventional. Her response had to be as sophisticated as the insult had been. Later that day, in the quiet of her real office at the American Perspective, the one with a view of the Capitol Dome, she found her weapon. It would not be a headline. It would be something far more subtle, and to its intended audience of one, far more terrifying. She began to write her monthly letter from the editor. Typically, these letters were reflections on the state of journalism, on the theme of the issue, on the political climate. This one would be different. She chose her topic with the care of an assassin selecting a poison. The title was On the Currency of Legacy and the Counterfeit of Charm. She did not mention him by name. She did not mention an affair. She wrote with eloquent and chilling prose about the sacred trust between a mentor and a student. She wrote about how easily the language of history and power can be perverted, used not to enlighten but to seduce. She wrote about the unique vulnerability of institutions, be they a university, a magazine, or a marriage, to threats that come from within. She crafted a paragraph about how certain objects, a pen, a chair, a book, are not mere things, but vessels of legacy, and to treat them with disrespect is to show contempt for the history they represent. Every sentence was a polished stone, and she was building a monument to his disgrace. It was a letter that any casual reader would see as a thoughtful, if unusually pointed, academic critique. But to Miles, every word would be a bullet. It was a warning shot, a demonstration of power. It was Kate telling him, in the only language she truly trusted, the printed word, that she knew everything, and that she had the power to frame the narrative in any way she saw fit. She was giving him a glimpse of the intellectual annihilation she was capable of. She finished the letter, read it over once, her face an unreadable mask. Then she saved the document and attached it to an email addressed to her editorial board for review. The first salvo had been written. It was now waiting to be fired. And Kate Sterling, a woman whose life had been dedicated to publishing the truth, was about to discover the devastating power of telling a story that was true in every way that mattered. In the world of high-stakes journalism, every significant piece, especially one as pointed and personal as Kate's letter from the editor, had to pass through the hands of the magazine's chief legal counsel. Arthur Vance was a man in his late 60s, a quiet, meticulous lawyer who had been with the American Perspective since Kate's father ran it. He was more than a lawyer. He was a guardian of the institution, a man whose job was to see the icebergs beneath the surface of the water. He summoned Kate to his office the following afternoon. His corner suite was a fortress of legal texts and quiet competence, a stark contrast to the creative energy of the editorial floor. He had her letter printed out on his desk, his notations marked in the margins with a fine-tipped red pen. "Catherine," he began, his voice calm and measured, "this is a masterfully written piece of prose. It's sharp, it's evocative, and it's defensible. On the surface, it's a commentary on academic ethics. No names are mentioned. We are not exposed to a libel suit." He paused, leaning back in his leather chair. "However, we both know what this letter truly is. It's a targeted strike. And in my experience, when you fire a shot this precise, you must be prepared for the ricochet." Kate met his gaze, unflinching. "I am prepared, Arthur. Are you?" He pressed gently. "Your husband is a public figure, a respected one. This letter, however veiled, will create speculation. People in this town are experts at connecting dots, even dots that aren't there. My concern is not libel. My concern is blowback. Has Miles entered into any professional agreements, any partnerships or funding arrangements that could be compromised if a public scandal, even a minor one, were to attach itself to his name?" Kate paused. It was a standard, prudent question, one she should have considered herself. "He manages a historical research grant," she said. "The Bixby Grant for European Studies. It's prestigious but fairly standard, funded by a consortium of foundations." Arthur made a note. "A consortium," he repeated. "I think it would be wise to know exactly who is in that consortium. Due diligence. Before we publish this, I want to know exactly where all the enemy's pieces are on the board. Let me look into it. I'll be in touch by the end of the day." The call came at 5:30 p.m. It was not Arthur's usual calm, end-of-day summary. His voice over the phone was tight, stripped of its usual pleasantries. "Kate, do not leave your office. I'm coming over. We need to talk in person, now." A knot of cold dread formed in Kate's stomach. Arthur Vance was not a man given to drama. For him to demand an in-person meeting with such urgency meant he had found something far more dangerous than a simple conflict of interest. He had found an iceberg. He arrived 10 minutes later, holding a slim file folder, He closed the door to her office, a gesture that amplified the sudden, oppressive silence. He didn't sit down. He walked straight to her desk and opened the folder, laying a single document on her blotter. It wasn't the Bixby Grant Charter. The letterhead was different, bearing the logo of a sleek modern tech foundation she didn't recognize. The Bixby Grant was a dead end, Arthur said, his voice low and grave. Standard stuff, but while digging, I found that Miles secured a much larger private grant 6 months ago, one he never mentioned to us, to anyone it seems. He tapped a paragraph deep within the document. I've been a lawyer in this town for 40 years, Kate. I've seen my share of predatory clauses, but this, he shook his head slowly, this is a work of art. Kate's eyes scanned the dense legal text. Her mind, trained to parse complex language, cut through the jargon and found the devastating core of it. The clause was titled, Ethical Integrity and Fiduciary Duty. It stated, in serene and chillingly precise terms, that the grant administrator, Miles Donovan, was bound not only by financial accountability, but by a standard of unimpeachable personal and professional conduct. The clause went on to specify that any public scandal, any confirmed report of moral turpitude or professional misconduct that brought the administrator or the grant into disrepute would constitute an immediate and catastrophic material breach of contract. A morality clause, Kate breathed, the words tasting like ash. It was an archaic, puritanical tool, rarely seen in modern agreements. Worse, Arthur corrected, it's a weaponized morality clause. Look at the consequences of the breach. Her eyes fell to the next paragraph. In the event of such a breach, the benefactor retained the right to not only terminate all funding, but to immediately assume control of all research, data, and intellectual property generated by the grant. The benefactor would, in essence, own all of Miles's work, his theories, his discoveries, his very professional essence. A chilling thought snaked into her mind. The photograph, the public nature of the humiliation. It was the perfect trigger for this exact clause. Someone had not only known about Miles's affair, they had been counting on it becoming public. Who is the benefactor, Arthur? She asked, though her gut was already screaming the answer. Who would build a trap this specific, this diabolical? Arthur met her eyes, his own filled with a grim understanding. He didn't need to say the name. He simply pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the document. The signature was a sharp, aggressive scrawl. Harrison King. The name landed in the room like a grenade. Harrison King, the libertarian tech billionaire. The man who saw traditional media as an enemy to be dismantled. The man who had been trying to buy the American perspective for years, vowing to gut it and rebuild it as a mouthpiece for his own radical ideology. Her father had called him a digital barbarian, a man who wanted to burn down the library of civilization to build a server farm on its ashes. He was Kate's professional nemesis, her opposite in every way that mattered. In that instant, the entire chessboard was revealed. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying, gut-wrenching clarity. This was never about a foolish professor and his starstruck student. Miles wasn't the player, he was the pawn. Ashley Finch wasn't the seductress, she was the bait. The affair, the selfie, the anonymous tip to Kate's encrypted phone, it was all a script. A meticulously crafted play, designed and funded by Harrison King. He had built a cage for Miles, baited it with youth and flattery, and then waited patiently for the trap to spring. He knew Kate. He knew her integrity, her refusal to suffer fools or betrayals. He gambled that if presented with evidence of her husband's infidelity, she would do something to make it public. Her letter from the editor, the very weapon she thought was her own brilliant idea, would have been the trigger that fired King's gun. The goal was monstrous in its ambition. By triggering the morality clause, King would seize control of Miles's research. He would own the work of a respected Georgetown historian, giving him a veneer of intellectual legitimacy. But more than that, he would have a direct, public link to a scandal involving the husband of the editor-in-chief of the American Perspective. He could use that leverage to embarrass the magazine, to force Kate to resign, to create chaos among the board of directors, and to finally make his move to buy the company in the ensuing turmoil. The searing personal pain of her husband's betrayal was suddenly dwarfed by the arctic, impersonal horror of this conspiracy. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a corporate assassination attempt, and her own marriage, her own home, had been turned into the kill zone. Kate leaned back in her chair, the letter from the editor on her desk suddenly looking like a child's toy. She had been playing checkers while her true enemy was playing a game of three-dimensional chess. The fury she felt now was different. It was no longer the anger of a wife betrayed. It was the cold, unadulterated rage of a queen whose kingdom was under siege. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but resonating with a newfound, dangerous weight. "Get me everything you have on Harrison King's other ventures. Every shell corporation, every private foundation, every dark money donation. I am no longer writing a letter." She looked out the window at the Capitol dome, no longer seeing it as a symbol of democracy, but as the center of a battlefield. "I'm preparing for war." The atmosphere at the American Perspective changed overnight. To the outside world, to the bustling reporters and editors on the main floor, it was business as usual. But on the executive level, in a soundproofed conference room that had been unofficially commandeered, a silent war had begun. Kate, alongside her trusted lawyer Arthur Vance and her top investigative reporter, a relentless bulldog of a man named Ben Carter, had formed a secret trinity. They called it the King File. The room became their war room. A large whiteboard was wheeled in, soon covered in a spider web of names, shell corporations, and arrows drawn in red and black ink. It was a map of Harrison King's shadowy empire. Ben Carter, a man who could smell a lie through a concrete wall, began digging into King's financial dealings with the ferocity of a starved wolf. Arthur Vance started mapping out the legal traps King might lay for them, preparing counter moves for a battle that hadn't even started. But Kate knew that financial records and legal theory were only part of the equation. King's trap, for all its corporate sophistication, had a fatal flaw. It relied on human beings, and human beings were fallible. They had fears, ambitions, and breaking points. The conspiracy had two critical human components: her husband Miles, the pawn, and the student, Ashley Finch, the asset that had been deployed against them. Kate decided to start with the asset. Miles was a complex target, his motivations tangled in 2 decades of shared history, love, and now profound betrayal. Approaching him required a different kind of strategy. Ashley, however, was simpler. She was a young woman on the make, driven by ambition. And right now, Kate gambled. She was also terrified. She had been a willing participant in what she likely thought was a simple, if risky, affair to advance her career. She could never have imagined she was a disposable piece in a multi-million-dollar corporate espionage plot. Her leverage, the affair itself, was now a liability of catastrophic proportions. Arranging the meeting was a delicate exercise in power. Kate didn't call Ashley directly. She sent a message through an intermediary in the Georgetown administration. A single cryptic sentence: "Catherine Sterling wishes to discuss your academic future. The Archives, Georgetown Library, tomorrow 4 p.m. It was not a request. It was a summons. The location was chosen with surgical precision. The library archives were neutral ground, yet undeniably Kate's world, a place of quiet, unimpeachable authority, surrounded by the weight of recorded history. Ashley arrived 5 minutes early, a telling sign of her anxiety. She had traded her defiant pout from the selfie for a mask of nervous bravado. She sat at a heavy oak table in the deserted reading room, surrounded by shelves of forgotten doctoral theses. The air smelled of old paper and fading ink. Kate arrived exactly at 4 p.m. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She placed a slim folder on the table between them, but did not open it. "Miss Finch," Kate began, her voice calm, almost academic. "You seem to be a student of history, so let's begin with a simple historical lesson. There are queens and there are pawns. The most dangerous position for a pawn to be in is to mistake herself for a queen." Ashley scoffed, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "I don't know what you're talking about. If this is about Professor Donovan—" "This has very little to do with Professor Donovan," Kate interrupted, her voice cutting through the girl's pretense. "He is, I'm afraid, another pawn in the same game as you. A more valuable one, perhaps, but a pawn nonetheless." Kate leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning the girl to her chair. "What I am here to discuss is your relationship with your other benefactor, Mr. Harrison King." The girl's face went white. The color drained away so fast she looked translucent under the dim library lights. The bravado vanished, replaced by pure, undiluted fear. It was the look of someone who had just realized the game they were playing was infinitely more dangerous than they had ever imagined. I don't. Please don't, Kate said, her voice softening, but with a sharp edge of impatience. Let's not waste each other's time with denials. I know he funded the scholarship that allowed you to study here. I know he arranged for you to be placed as my husband's research assistant. And I know that the photograph you took in my home and anonymously sent to me was not your idea. You were following a script. The problem is, you were never told how the play ends. Kate finally opened the folder. She slid a single document across the table. It was a copy of the grant agreement. She had highlighted the weaponized morality clause. Read this. Ashley's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. She read it once, then twice, her eyes wide with incomprehension, then dawning horror. You see, Kate explained, her tone now that of a professor patiently clarifying a difficult concept, you were never meant to win the professor. You were a tool, a trigger. Your purpose was to create a public scandal. That scandal would activate this clause. Harrison King would seize my husband's work, disgrace me, and launch a hostile takeover of my company. In that scenario, Miss Finch, you are not the victor. You are collateral damage, a minor character in a much larger story, a footnote in the ruin of several lives, including your own. Your academic career would be over. You'd be known forever as the girl at the center of a sordid plot. Harrison King would discard you without a second thought. Ashley stared at the paper, then at Kate, her eyes welling with tears of panic. What does he want? He wants my magazine, Kate said simply. And he used you and my husband to try and get it. Kate let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting the full weight of the truth crush the girl's remaining defenses. Then, she made her offer. I find myself in a position where I need to dismantle Mr. King's plans, she said, and you, inadvertently, have become a potential asset to me. You thought you were his player. I am offering you a chance to be mine. What do you want? Ashley whispered. Everything, Kate replied, her voice firm. Every email between you and King or his intermediaries, every text message, records of every phone call, every instruction you were given. I want the entire blueprint of his plot against my family. You will provide me with this evidence, and in return, this conversation never happened. Your name will never appear in any article I publish. When the dust settles, you will be allowed to quietly finish your degree and disappear. I will give you back your future. A future that I assure you, Harrison King has no intention of letting you have. She paused, delivering the final decisive blow. However, if you refuse, I will have no choice but to assume you are a willing co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar corporate espionage scheme, and I will act accordingly. The choice is yours, a clean slate or a starring role in a very ugly public trial. You have until tomorrow morning. Kate stood up, leaving the folder on the table. She didn't look back as she walked out of the archives, the sound of her heels echoing decisively in the silence. She had laid the trap, baited it not with money or threats, but with the one thing a person like Ashley Finch valued above all else, a chance at self-preservation. Early the next morning, an encrypted file arrived in Ben Carter's inbox. It was from an anonymous source. It contained a trove of emails. The first piece of hard evidence had just been secured. The pawn had been flipped. Now, Kate could turn her attention to the more difficult piece on the board, the one who was sleeping in their guest room, a ghost haunting the ruins of their life together, her husband. The guest room at the back of the Georgetown townhouse had become a liminal space, a cell of quiet disgrace. It was where Miles had taken refuge, a ghost in his own home. The air inside was stale, smelling of defeat and the faint, cloying scent of whiskey. Books lay unread on the nightstand. His suits, once worn with such confident swagger, hung in the closet like costumes for a play that had been canceled. For 3 days, since Kate had secured the evidence from Ashley Finch, she had left him in this self-imposed exile. It was a calculated move. She needed him broken, not just by his own guilt, but by the terrifying silence, by the slow, grinding realization of how much he had lost. She needed him to be at the absolute bottom before she could offer him a way up, a way up that served her purpose. She chose to approach him late in the evening. The house was quiet. She found him not in the guest room, but in the formal living room, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city lights. He looked like a shadow of his former self. The charismatic energy that had defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed emptiness. He had lost weight. He didn't turn as she entered. He seemed to have lost the energy even for surprise. "Have you come to deliver the final verdict?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of its usual melodic timbre. He was staring at his own faint reflection in the glass. "I've come to offer you a choice," Kate said, her voice steady and clinical. She placed a thick legal file on the glass coffee table between them. The sound was sharp, definitive. He finally turned, his expression a mixture of weary confusion and dread. "I know everything, Miles," she began, forgoing any prelude. "And I don't mean I know about your affair with Miss Finch. That, I now realize, was merely the prologue. I know about Harrison King. I know about the grant. I know about the morality clause. I know it was all a trap, designed to destroy me, using you as the bait." She watched him as she spoke, observing him with the detached focus of a scientist studying a specimen. She saw the cascade of emotions she expected. His weary confusion curdled into dawning horror, followed by a pathetic, impotent flicker of rage, not at her, but at his own staggering foolishness. He finally understood the true scale of his transgression. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been a collaborator in an attack against his own wife. He sank onto the plush sofa as if his legs had given out, burying his face in his hands. The sound he made was a choked, guttural whisper. "That bastard, that son of a bitch, all of it. He was playing me from the start." "Yes," Kate confirmed, her tone not accusatory, but as a statement of fact. "He played us all, and now I'm going to end the game. I'm preparing a story for the American perspective, the definitive story. We're going to publish everything." Miles looked up, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear, not the fear of a husband caught cheating, but the fear of a man who has seen a true predator up close. "You're insane," he breathed. "He'll destroy you. He's not like me, Kate. He is a killer. He will bury the magazine in lawsuits. He'll ruin you." "I'm aware of the risks," she said calmly, "but the story is infinitely stronger with your cooperation. I don't just need to expose the mechanism of his trap. I need to expose the human cost. I need the voice of the man who was caught in it." She slid a single, multi-page document and a pen across the table. It was an affidavit, meticulously drafted by Arthur Vance. "I need you to sign this," she said. "It's a full confession. I need you to detail every conversation you had with King or his people, every reassurance he gave you, every pressure he applied, your growing fears, your moments of weakness, everything. Your testimony is the nail that seals his coffin." He stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. A bitter, broken laugh escaped his lips, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "And why in God's name would I do that?" he spat, a spark of his old fire returning, fueled by desperation. "To help you, the woman who is about to publicly execute me alongside him. You took my life, Kate, and you set it on fire." Kate met his gaze. She did not flinch. For the first time, the clinical detachment in her voice subsided, replaced by something far more potent, a cold, hard, and undeniable truth. "I did not take your life," she corrected him. "I took the life you were living, the one built on a lie you were telling yourself and me. Now I am offering you the chance to build a new one, a different one." She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights. "Right now, your legacy, the story that will be told about you, the story our son will one day read, is that of a fool. A respected professor brought down by a cheap affair with his student, a cliché, a footnote." She turned back to face him. "This," she gestured to the affidavit, "is your one and only chance to change that narrative. You can be the man who was duped, who was preyed upon by a powerful sociopath, but who in the end found the courage to do the right thing. The man who stood up and helped expose a true villain to protect his family, to protect the very idea of truth he dedicated his life to teaching." She walked back to the table and pushed the pen closer to his hand. "You can be a tragic figure, Miles, but you can also be a brave one. Or you can be the coward who hid in a borrowed room while his wife fought the dragon he let through the gates. The choice is yours." Define how you will be remembered. This is the last and most important choice you will ever get to make. He looked from the pen to her face, searching her eyes for a hint of pity, of lingering affection, of anything that would make this easier. He found none. He saw no malice, but he saw no warmth either. He saw a general giving a disgraced soldier a final, terrible choice: die by a firing squad for desertion, or die honorably on the battlefield, taking the enemy down with you. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. The weight of it seemed immense. He uncapped it, the small click echoing loudly in the silent room. He bent over the document, his shoulders slumped, a man signing away the last remnants of his old life. But as he began to write, a subtle shift occurred. The shaking subsided. His signature on the last page was not the scrawl of a defeated man, but the firm, clear script of a historian, recording a painful but necessary truth for the official record. He had made his choice. Kate watched him, her face unreadable. She had secured her most important witness. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. The story was now complete, and it was going to be devastating. The Sunday edition of the American Perspective landed on doorsteps across Washington, D.C., not with a thud, but with the force of a controlled detonation. There was no salacious photograph on the cover. There was no gossip. The cover was stark, severe, and terrifyingly official. A single bold headline in the magazine's authoritative font: "The Kingmaker's Trap, an investigation into corporate espionage, predatory philanthropy, and the weaponization of private lives." The story that followed was not an editorial. It was a tour de force of investigative journalism, a multi-page, meticulously researched exposé that laid bare Harrison King's entire plot. Ben Carter's reporting had unearthed a damning trail of dark money, funneling from King's tech empire through a labyrinth of shell corporations and foundations, all leading to the grant that had ensnared Miles Donovan. They published flowcharts mapping the money trail. They published excerpts from King's aggressive loan agreements with other smaller companies he had swallowed. And at its heart, displayed with the devastating clarity of a legal exhibit, was a scanned copy of the full signed affidavit from Professor Miles Donovan. His confession was not presented as the confession of a cheating husband, but as the sworn testimony of a key witness in a major corporate conspiracy. It was the human narrative that gave the cold hard facts their soul. It detailed King's subtle manipulations, the psychological pressure, the way ambition had been expertly twisted into a weapon of self-destruction. The effect was instantaneous and seismic. It detonated in newsrooms, in boardrooms, and on the floors of Congress. The story was picked up globally, not as a piece of society gossip, but as a major financial and ethical bombshell. The narrative Kate had so brilliantly framed was unassailable. This wasn't a wife getting revenge. This was a prestigious journalistic institution defending itself and American democracy from a hostile attack by a predator. Harrison King, as predicted, came out swinging. His PR machine went into overdrive. He appeared on a rival news network, his face a mask of patrician outrage, calling Kate a deranged and vindictive woman, abusing her father's legacy to settle a personal score. He filed a staggering billion-dollar lawsuit against the magazine for defamation. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had intended to paint Kate as an unhinged woman. Instead, he looked like a cornered tyrant. By suing, he had fallen into her final, most brilliant trap. The lawsuit opened him up to the legal process of discovery. His entire empire, built in the murky depths of offshore secrecy and backroom deals, would be dragged kicking and screaming into the sunlight of open court. He had thrived in darkness, and Kate had just turned on every floodlight on the eastern seaboard. His partners and investors, terrified of the legal exposure, began to abandon him in droves. Regulators, who had long been suspicious of his methods, suddenly had the public mandate and the hard evidence to open sweeping formal investigations. His empire, built on fear and shadows, could not withstand the harsh glare of public scrutiny. It began to crumble, not in a single crash, but in a slow, agonizing cascade of failures. 6 months later, Harrison King was finished. He was forced to resign from his own company under a cloud of scandal, liquidating assets to cover his mounting legal fees and settle with furious investors. He was a ruined man, a king deposed by the very truth he had sought to manipulate. The divorce between Catherine and Miles proceeded with a quiet, somber dignity. There was nothing left to fight over. Miles, as part of his cooperation, had willingly signed away his claims to their shared assets. He resigned from his professorship at Georgetown. He left Washington, D.C. Without a word, a disgraced but free man, with just enough to start over somewhere anonymous and quiet. He had become the tragic figure Kate had offered him, a man who lost everything but in the final act had chosen a sliver of honor over a lifetime of shame. Kate Sterling stood alone at the helm of her empire, more powerful and respected than ever before. She had faced the ultimate personal betrayal and a catastrophic corporate threat, and had emerged victorious. But the victory was not without its scars. Her marriage was a memory. Her family was indelibly fractured. The silence in the Georgetown townhouse was no longer peaceful. It was just empty. One evening, months later, as the first snow of winter began to fall on the city, her son, a law student at Yale, called her. There had been a strained distance between them since the scandal broke. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I had a professor in my corporate ethics class use your investigation as a case study today, on the Kingmaker's trap." Kate's hand tightened on the phone. She held her breath. "We spent the whole lecture breaking it down," he continued. "The legal strategy, the journalistic integrity, everything. I finally understand what you were doing and why you had to do it. I wanted to say I'm proud of you." Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in Kate's eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. They were not tears of sadness or anger, but of a profound, aching relief. The one judgment that had ever truly mattered had been rendered in her favor. "But I have to ask," her son said, a genuine curiosity in his tone. "That first piece you wrote, the letter from the editor that you never published, Ben Carter mentioned it once. Was that part of the plan, too? Was that the first strategic move against King?" Kate looked out the window at the soft white blanket of snow covering the city, quieting its sharp edges, making the world seem clean again. A small, sad but resolute smile touched her lips. "No," she admitted, her voice a soft, honest whisper. "That wasn't strategy. That wasn't for the magazine. That wasn't for King." She paused, taking a deep breath, finally closing the last file in her own mind. "That was for me." She had won the war, saved her legacy, and in the end, earned back her son. The fortress of her life had been breached, its foundations shaken to the core, but in its place she had built something new, something forged in fire, made of steel and ink, a throne of her own magnificent, painful, and solitary design.